True, let's not meet. Stories. I was almost cooked alive. When I was 10, my parents and I went to visit my grandmother for spring break. My cousin also came to visit, and we decided we wanted to go to the YMCA for the day. My grandmother dropped us off and said she would come and pick us up in 4 hours. On that day, the YMCA was empty. There were a couple of adults in the exercise room, but that's it. We went to the basketball court, and after 2 hours of playing tag and shooting baskets, we were bored. I've never been the biggest fan of swimming, but this YMCA had a pretty cool pool, so we changed into our bathing suits and headed in there. The pool was empty except for the lifeguard. We played a bunch of games and swam laps, but after about an hour, there wasn't much left to do, and there was no one except us to hang out with to keep things interesting. So, we decided to play a game of seeing how long we could hold our breath underwater. We stood in the shallow end near the clock on the wall so we could time ourselves. Instead of fully submerging, we just stuck our heads in, face down in the water. We did this a couple of times, and I was winning. On our last round, I felt a tap on my shoulder. I figured it was my cousin giving up and telling me that I won. But instead, it was the lifeguard who told me to knock it off, or she was going to have to ask us to leave the pool. Since we were tired of being in the pool, we figured we would get out, get dressed, and go back to the basketball court until my grandmother picked us up. We only had an hour left anyways, and the water was freezing. As we got out, the lifeguard stopped us and asked us if we wanted to go into the sauna to warm up and dry off. The sign said 18 years or older, so of course, we were super excited that she allowed us to do that. She walked us to the sauna and unlocked the door. The door was glass, and the interior was made entirely of wood. Inside above the door, there was a clock, probably to help make sure you were not in there for an unsafe amount of time. The lifeguard stand was adjacent to the sauna, but if you looked out the door, you could clearly see it. She followed us in and went over to the thermometer encased in plastic and unlocked it so she could crank the heat. I figured that she must have to turn it on each time, so I didn't think anything of it. Both my cousin and I were very short girls, and so we couldn't see the temperature, but I knew she was turning up the heat. Then she left and shut the door behind her. I thought I saw her lock the door too, but I thought to myself, why would she lock the door when we might want to get out? I checked the clock and decided we should get out in 10 or 15 minutes. It was already plenty warm in the sauna, but now the room was blazing. It felt nice because I was so cold from the pool. After about 15 minutes, it was starting to get a little bit too hot, and my cousin agreed that we should leave so we can get dressed. I went to turn the knob on the door, but it wasn't budging. I thought maybe it was jammed, so I shook it, but it still wasn't opening. And then I let my cousin try. She couldn't get it open either. We figured the lifeguard would be back in a couple of minutes, so we sat back down and waited. The room was getting hotter now too, and I really wanted to leave. I got up and started banging on the door and twisting the knob, trying to get the lifeguard's attention. My cousin got up and joined me. We started screaming at the top of our lungs for her to let us out, but she just stared straight ahead. I don't think there's any way that she couldn't have noticed or heard 2 little girls kicking the door and screaming. Now we had been in there for about 25 minutes. It was so hot in the sauna that it hurt to breathe. It felt like my lungs were on fire. My eyes and skin were burning. We sat back down and put our towels over our heads because they were still a little damp and it made it easier to breathe. I was so worried about my cousin as she is a couple of years younger than me. I looked up at the clock and saw that we had been in there for 35 minutes. I got up and walked to the door again and saw the lifeguard still just staring straight ahead. Again, I tried to get her attention by screaming that we needed out and banging on the door as hard as I could, but still nothing. I was starting to get pretty dizzy, so I went to go sit back down, but the wooden seats of the sauna burned my skin. My towel was completely dry, so I put it underneath me to sit on. My hair was also dry, but I wrapped it across my face to cover my nose, and I squinted my eyes so that they didn't burn as bad, but I could still watch if anyone walked past the door. It helped a little bit. My cousin was laying face down with a towel over her head, not moving or saying anything, so I nudged her to make sure that she was still okay. She was, but I could tell that we really needed to get out of there soon because she seemed a bit disoriented. It had been 45 minutes now, and I was extremely nauseous. There was no way that the lifeguard would forget that we were in there, and I thought she would have to come back soon, but there was this little voice in my head telling me that maybe she purposely locked us in there. Finally, a man walked past the door towards the pool, but for some reason, I just couldn't get up. My whole body was on fire, and I felt so dizzy. Luckily, this man wasn't going to the pool. He wanted to be let into the sauna and came back with the lifeguard. I saw them walking this way, and I immediately jumped up to grab my cousin. I knew now that for sure she had locked us in there because she pulled out her keys to unlock the door and let the man in. I didn't want to take any chances of us being trapped in there any longer, so as the man was trying to walk in, I was trying to shove our way out. As we were going out, the lifeguard started trying to shut the door and push us back with it. The man was clearly confused about what was going on and said, I think they want out. The lifeguard let out a sigh and opened the door fully, and we ran away as fast as we could into the changing room. We only had about 10 minutes before my grandmother was supposed to pick us up. We were both so shaken by what had just happened that we didn't say anything to each other as we got dressed or on the car ride home. When we got back to the house, my parents were making us dinner, and I told them the story of what just happened. They thought I must have been exaggerating, and they didn't believe me. I truly think that the woman was going to let us cook alive in there. The only bit of doubt that I have is what would have happened if we actually died. She obviously would have gotten the blame. What was her endgame? I'm 21 now, but I think about this interaction all the time. And when I'm in small spaces, or I get too warm, I still have panic attacks. No one believes this story, and I get it. It's pretty absurd. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to ask for opinions, but do you think this could have been some crazy misunderstanding? Or do you think that she really left us in there to die? And why? So, to the lifeguard at the YMCA, please, let's not meet again. Hooded man in the woods. Alright, I spent my entire slow day at work yesterday reading through this sub, so now I want to share my little story. My childhood best friend Marie and I were around 11 or 12 years old at the time. Marie's family had their own campsite in a provincial park about 2 hours from our hometown, and we would spend the entire summer each year living in their camper out there. This particular summer, I was able to go and stay with them for a week, and we were excited to spend our time adventuring around the forest. On the last time that I was there, we decided we wanted to hurry down to the ice cream shop by the lake before it closed. It was early evening at this point, still pretty bright out, but beginning to lose light. The path we took was down a short slope right next to the main road, with maybe 10 feet of thick brush and trees in between. On the other side was the forest, with more tall and thick brush. So we were walking along, not seeing a single other person on the path in front or behind us. We hear a sudden rustling and snapping of branches, similar to the sound of maybe a deer moving through the woods. I wouldn't have thought anything of it, but then the sound of running footsteps follows. Marie glances back and suddenly grabs my arm, urging me under her breath not to look back. At the same time, the running stops. I don't know why I didn't ignore her and get a look myself. I guess I could sense the very real fear in her voice and chose to listen. We both start to panic, getting that feeling like when you're running up the stairs after turning the basement light off. We pick up speed as much as we can without breaking into a sprint, knowing the ice cream shop is only about a minute walk away at this point. The path soon breaks, and we're in the parking lot. Suddenly, Marie steers me hard to the left, heading towards the lake and boat rental instead of continuing straight to the ice cream shop, and I go along with it silently, understanding ice cream is no longer an interest. But it seems whatever scared her is nowhere in sight at this point. Marie walks up to the boat rental and gets us a kayak, and we climb in, paddling out into the middle of the lake. As we paddle, she tells me that there was a man behind us, and that the man had stopped running very abruptly upon making eye contact with her. He had been wearing a long black coat with the hood up, despite it being the middle of July. He had a terrible smirk on his face, and she swore that as he stopped running, she saw him put something shiny away into his coat. He appeared to have just emerged out of the bushes after we walked past, given the sounds we heard right before he came running onto the path. We reach the center of the lake and stop paddling. I pull out my Nokia brick phone that my parents, thank God, had given me, just in case. I hand it to Marie and tell her to call her parents to come pick us up. As the phone rings, I see her look out past me to the shore and go pale, lifting a hand to point to what she was seeing. I turn, and there was the man, stalking his way around the path that circled the edge of the lake, staring out at us. We sat in the middle of the lake and watched him do 2 full laps, never looking away from us, before finally disappearing. It took a few tries to get a hold of her family. We were freaking out so bad the whole time, as the sun got lower and lower. We did manage to have someone come with the truck, but by the time we reached the shore, it was pretty dark outside. I don't know what we would have done if we hadn't been able to call for a ride. Looking back, I don't know why we didn't just go up to the ice cream shop, inform an adult there, and ask her parents to come get us then. But it worked out. We got back safe, and we thankfully never saw the man again. I am never exploring, ever again. Now, this is something I really want to talk about, to be sure that everyone is cautious and stays level-headed at all times. Now for context, I lived in the middle of nowhere in Canada. It was an old town that had quite a few abandoned buildings due to absence of residents. Me and many friends were tired of the lack of entertainment options for us, so what we did was explore these abandoned buildings. Prior to this experience, we never had anything too crazy happen to us. Occasionally, we'd see a small bit of blood-like liquid, and we did see a pentagram on the ground from someone who went to a house previously, but nothing too bad, until the last time I had gone exploring abandoned buildings. Now, when I was younger, I used to go to a daycare that was part mental hospital. Weird combination, I know. It closed down due to a lack of patients and lack of children at the daycare. I decided to go back there with my friends a few years ago. For context, I was 15 when this happened. Most of my friends were the same age. When we did get there, it was rather cliché. There was a fog, it was dark, and there was a light drizzle of rain. We went to the main gate, which was padlocked shut. We decided to help each other hop over and made a ton of noise in the process. We were laughing and giggling the whole time, unsuspecting of what was to come. We looked around the small daycare with flashlights we had on us. Even with our somewhat powerful flashlights, our visibility was rather limited. We decided to enter the decaying building. Glass and dirt crunched under our feet as we stepped into the daycare section of the complex. There were still old Legos, wood chips from previous furniture, old torn dolls, and toys strewn about. The further we walked around the daycare section, we naturally became more and more silent until all we could hear was the crunch of the dirt under our feet. I found some crayons in a plastic container in the corner of the room. I walked over to pick them up, when all of a sudden we heard a loud crash coming from behind a metal door, leading to the psych ward part of the building. My friends and I looked at each other. As a whole, we were a group of 5. Most of them were very bold and cocky. We all looked at each other when my friend Brian suggested we go and look to see where the sound came from. Personally, I was not fond of the idea, but with my group of friends, there was no way anyone was going to decline such a thing. We all stacked up on the door and opened it. It was rusted to the floor, and we heaved to get it open. As we walked in, the metallic smells became stronger, with a hint of something else which I couldn't put my finger on at that moment. We walked in, our flashlights pointed in every direction, with Brian leading the group. The hallways were tight, and to the left and right were the occasional metal doorway, some with doors open. I felt slightly claustrophobic, and it felt hard to breathe. As we continued, Brian shone his flashlight into a room and recoiled. We all stopped walking as Brian slowly entered the room. "What is it?" I asked him. "I thought I saw someone, but it seems all fine now." To be honest, I thought he was just messing with us to increase our anxiety. But looking back, I think he was being completely honest. He backed out of the room and we continued walking deeper into the psych ward when another friend swiftly told us to stop. We came to a halt and all listened. In the distance ahead of us, we heard the subtle pitter-patter of footsteps echo through the hallway. We all looked at each other, fear in each of our eyes. Brian continued walking towards the sounds. We considered turning back for a second without him, wondering if some ghost or something was in the building. But we couldn't do that to him. The closer we got, the more I felt like I was being watched, when finally we entered a room on the right which had the smell of rotting meat. In front of us was a deer carcass. Its innards were spilled all over the floor, staining the concrete. A friend of mine had a very weak stomach and vomited all over the floor. That's when we heard whispering from somewhere. Brian quickly shone his flashlight to the corner of the room where a man with short hair was standing with his head down. He wore a bright green shirt stained with what I assume was blood and torn beige pants. He did not have any socks and his feet seemed damaged. He was twitching sporadically and continued to mumble even after we saw him. We stared at him for a solid 30 seconds before he made his first true movement. He looked up at us with a haunting grin that sent shivers down our spine. "You guys here for the feast?" he said, each word with varying inflection and energy. This kicked us over the edge and we bolted out of that room all the way back down to the daycare center. The door was still open and we decided to try and slam it shut, but the rust and pure weight of the door almost kept it open. It took 3 of us pulling with all of our strength to close it. And just before we did, I could still see the silhouette of the man watching us, his white teeth being the only other human feature I could see. We sat behind the metal door, catching our breath for a second, all looking at each other for confirmation that we all saw the same thing. After a little bit of labored breathing from each of us, we heard a light tapping on the door. That's when we decided that it was time to leave. We booked it out of there and ran home. A year after we visited that spot, police went back to do a routine search of the area and found the man. It was stated that this guy used to go to the psych ward before it closed down. He escaped the facility he was transferred to and lived off the wildlife around the complex. When the cops brought him in, he had a series of sickness and disease from eating raw meat. His mental condition was much worse than before. There were future rumors that he did kill someone in the forest while searching for food, but nothing has been confirmed. In the end, guys, be careful, especially in dangerous areas such as abandoned buildings. And creepy dude, let's not meet again. That's not my friend in the woods. I grew up out in the wooded country in Illinois, on a short dead-end street about 10 miles from a town. There were 7 houses in the area spread out, each on 2.5-acre wooded lots or larger. There were no large wild animals. There aren't any bears or other large animals in the region, and people didn't meander there or show up lost. Actually, lost folks or large animals wandering around never happened in the 20 years I lived there. So please, keep that in mind. When I was a young girl in my early teens, I had a good guy friend a few years older than me who lived next door. Terry. Terry was allowed to go out with his friends much later than I was, and he would sometimes tromp over to my yard after getting home late, throwing rocks from the gravel area outside at my window to chat. My bed was right next to the window. I'd open the window and we'd whisper stories and generally talk for a bit. My second-story window faced our backyard, and his house was to the side. I could see his house from my window, over the shrub trees, and walking path to his driveway. I'd often know if he was out by the light over the side door entrance. If he was home, the light was off. One time during the summer, when my window was open, I heard a car in his driveway dropping him off. I was probably 14 years old, and it was around midnight. I heard Terry get out of a car and was talking to his friends. Soon his friends pulled away. I softly called out, as loud as I could without waking my parents, asking Terry to stop by and chat. He didn't respond, as he probably didn't hear me. Then I came up with a not-so-brilliant idea to sneak outside and scare him. I'd spent many years in the woods, learning how to blend in and be silent. As kids, we'd often sneak around and scare each other. So I silently sneaked down from the second floor and out my back garage door, which led to our backyard below my window. This led to Terry's house off the side through our gravel area, then through a well-worn path through the woods, about 25 feet long. My parents had put in a gravel pit around the back of the house, probably because nothing grew there, due to the shade of the oak trees. There were 14-inch oak rounds set out as uneven stepping paths in the gravel, and if you stepped off the rounds, the crunch of gravel would give you away. I picked my way expertly and silently across the log rounds, facing Terry's house. My eyes got accustomed to the dark and I didn't see him. Also at that time, I heard the door of his house close and the light going off, signaling he went in and likely to bed. I waited a bit, as I thought I saw something move in the woods between our houses, but not on the path we'd always use. If you didn't use the path, there were wild rose and raspberry plants that had thorns and were painful to walk through if you weren't careful. So I thought it was odd that he'd be in the woods, but maybe he wanted to scare me like I was plotting to do to him. But I saw something human-sized and dark moving through the woods slowly and pause every once in a while, just like me. It was coming closer, and I definitely saw it, but it was strange in that it wasn't walking directly to my window to talk. Therefore, I hunched down and waited in silence, wondering if I could still scare him. I still thought it was Terry, and that he saw me sneak out and he was trying to scare me. I watched a dark outline of a human figure moving, but then I would lose sight of it in the foliage. It seemed to be stalking slowly and listening every few feet while hiding, so I whispered after losing patience one last time for Terry, but he didn't answer. I got bored of hiding and crouching, So I quietly tiptoed back to my garage door and went back inside, quietly locking up as I went. I snuck back upstairs to my room above the area where I was crouching. My window was open and I definitely heard someone, or something, walking around the yard. I whispered again for Terry out my window but got no answer. Then I heard someone, or something, fall and grunt loudly at the window well right below my window. It wasn't enough to wake my parents, but definitely loud enough that I didn't mistake it, and it sent a shock of fear through me. If you aren't familiar with a window well, it's a semicircle hole connected to the house, dug out about 3 or 4 feet deep and reinforced with metal. It allows a basement window to be put in below ground level, and the hole lets some natural light in. There is no way Terry would have fallen in our window well. We had been playing hide and seek in many outdoor games for years since we were young around the whole neighborhood. We knew everyone's window wells, house footprints, and paths in the woods like the back of our hands. The grunt sounded humanish and not like an animal. It also pulled itself out quietly, without a lot of thrashing. That's when I realized this wasn't a fun game, and someone or something was out there, and it wasn't Terry. I tried to look outside my window as best as I could, but there was a screen to keep the bugs out, so I couldn't lean my head out to see next to the wall of our house directly below me. I then heard the crunch of rocks as whatever it was stepped on the gravel. Again, Terry would know where the log rounds were and would not step in the gravel. He knew my parents were pretty strict, and he was as good at being quiet as I was. Whatever it was stopped and I held my breath. I pretty much sat there with my face pressed against the screen 2 stories up for probably half hour. It seemed like an hour, but I'm pretty sure I didn't have patience back then to wait that long. I never heard it leave, but I grew tired and eventually fell asleep on my bed that was next to the window. There are a few things I'm certain of. It wasn't Terry. I asked him later, and he said he went to bed that night when he got home. He also would have no reason to lie. I'm pretty sure it wasn't one of our neighbors, and I can't think of any reason a person would be there. We had few neighbors, and only 2 other houses out of 7 had kids. Again, these 7 houses were spread out on 2.5 acres per home. There weren't any big animals in the area. As wooded as the whole area was, we only had some deer, but they were hunted and didn't come close to our homes. Plus, our dog scared them away. So, stranger in the woods, let's not meet again. Black car in London. This happened years ago when I was barely 14. My middle school, and the middle school of my best friend at the time, organized a trip abroad to Great Britain. London, to be exact. It was supposed to be a few days, looking at London attractions, museums and shops. It was fun, until it wasn't. The day before we were supposed to go home, we were brought to a street with some interesting shops, and we received free time for shopping. And then our teachers and guide had a brilliant idea. They told us after the time for shopping ends, we would have to meet at a different street than the one we were on. In retrospect, it was only about 100 meters away, but they still shouldn't have done that. Most of us had never been in London, could barely speak English, didn't have a map of the city, and roaming services didn't work correctly. 90% of students got lost. I got lost with my best friend because we went in the complete opposite direction. We were both confused about the directions that were given. We were walking along the pavement. My friend was running ahead and also looking around nervously. We didn't look like we were together because we were not interacting with each other. I guess that's why this happened. My friend ran ahead and stopped to look around when I saw a black car approach me and match my speed. I started to feel like I was in a scene from a movie. It was broad daylight. There were a lot of people around, but no one reacted. I was confused and didn't know what was happening. Then from inside the car, a man stepped out and said, "You are nice. Come with me," and then tried to grab me. The car was still running, so I suppose someone was still inside. I was stunned. I couldn't believe it was real. At that moment, my friend ran over to me from behind, grabbed me, and dragged me away. We ran and tried losing the car in case it was following us. After some time we stopped, and my friend nervously cried, shaking me and screaming why I didn't move when the man tried to grab me. I explained my deer in headlights moment. We calmed down and managed to ask some people for help, and we were soon found by our teachers. We didn't tell anyone there what happened. We were sure no one would believe us. After that, when we got back, I told my parents. My mom considered all of that really unprofessional and irresponsible. I never went on a trip organized by my school ever again. Bare feet. There's an abandoned house between my town and the town next to me on one of the country roads that connects us. I've been to it before, and even went inside twice with my sister and best friend. It's an old house that dates back centuries, according to the bank records that I was able to find, and you can just tell by the design. The house is 2 stories with a basement, has lots of furniture and objects strewn about inside, and is far from empty. You can tell that it hasn't been lived in for decades, and whoever had previously owned it, it almost seemed like they just disappeared one day, leaving everything behind. The way I was able to get in before was through the cellar door in the basement, which is broken and propped open with some big sticks. My first visits were around 2 years ago, and I hadn't gone back at all in that time. Another friend had expressed interest in seeing the house when I told him about my experience, and so last summer, I told him that I'd take him there. I never thought it was a dangerous trip, and told him that it's just an interesting place to explore. We parked across the street from the house, in the parking lot of one of the industrial buildings nearby. It was a country road, but it was far from unused, and we didn't want to be questioned by anyone. My friend, being braver than me, despite my previous visits, led the way across the street and to the front of the house. He asked me a couple of questions about it and what stuff I found in there. I told him that the kitchen still had expired food in it, and that the upstairs had a board game set that I ended up bringing home with me. As we walked from the front of the house to the side, leading to the back with the cellar, I made note that there was a lot more brush than when I had went last time. I had gone in the spring when I went with my sister and best friend, and I never experienced the thick brush that I was now carefully moving through. I made a comment to my friend that there was a lot more foliage than when I had gone before, as we both tried to figure out a path to the cellar. Eventually, we pushed through some branches and found the cellar, broken and propped open, just as I had last seen it. We talked for a second about being nervous, and I really took in the view of the cellar that led into this dark, abandoned house. I remember being really intimidated while looking at the opening, and I noted that some of the sticks propping open the cellar didn't look familiar to me. I didn't state it out loud, however, as I thought it was just my anxiety. My friend and I discussed who should go first, and he said since I'm the expert, I should go. Of course I was hesitant, but eventually, after a good 5 minutes of breathing and calming myself down, I started down the steps into the cellar. It was an awkward entrance, as half the cellar was collapsed and left little room for maneuvering. You had to duck under the part of the cellar door that was still put together, then inch your feet down the steps, and finally turn your body sideways to fit through the small gap in the basement. I took a long time after ducking under, since my nerves came back for a second. I made it in fine, and my friend followed very quickly, which I appreciated. We both stood in the corner of the basement now, taking it in. I turned my phone's flashlight on, and he did too. There was a spiderweb in the path to the stairs, leading up to the first floor. I looked around and found some sort of tool to knock the spiderweb down, and I swiped it through. After that, I tossed it onto the concrete floor. My friend and I talked quietly, and I don't remember what about, but afterwards, we fell silent for a second. I clearly heard footsteps on the boards above our heads. It almost seemed like they were heading to the stairs that led down to the basement. I remember this part the best, as I looked at my friend, and he didn't seem to react to the footsteps I was hearing. I looked at him, suddenly very worried, and before I could even say anything, he said, "We need to go." He turned around and practically jumped up the stairs. I remembered thinking he got out insanely fast. I could see him turn and reach his hand back to help me up. I was a bit slower, but I also quickly stepped up the stairs, and he pulled me through the opening. I landed on my hands and knees after I escaped the cellar, and I immediately stood up facing the weeds. I turned around to my friend, who was crouched, staring down into the cellar. I said to him that we should get out of here, and he turned away and told me to go first through the weeds. I pretty much just ran through the brush, definitely getting cut up by something, but we made it through them and back in front of the house very quickly. My friend kept urging me to go in front of him, and he watched behind us before flashing his light in the windows on the first floor. I asked him what he was doing and if he was okay. He didn't really answer me at first, so I asked him if he heard the footsteps before we bolted out of the basement. He turned to me and said that he heard them, and that's why he was watching the cellar. He continued, saying that after he pulled me up, he turned to guide me away before he let go of my hand, and when he turned back, he saw the bare feet of someone standing at the bottom of the cellar. Because of the cellar's dilapidated structure, he could only see their feet and a part of their legs. At that point, that's when he told me to go through the weeds first. He never saw them come up the cellar stairs or move away from them before he followed me. I didn't believe him at first and thought he was just trying to scare me, but I could tell by the serious tone of his voice and the silent look he gave me after telling me that he wasn't trying to make me laugh or lighten the mood. I still asked him if he was lying, and he aggressively said that he wasn't. He told me that I heard the footsteps already, so I knew something had to be in that house. We stood for a second, not really saying anything, before we both agreed to go back across the street towards our cars. We stood there for a while, watching the house to see if anything or anyone would come out, but nothing appeared. After talking about how crazy that was, and him reassuring me that he was telling the truth, it started to rain, and we decided to leave. I fully believe him, and he's always stood by what he saw. I haven't gone back to that house since, and I like to tell myself that whoever was in that house was just a homeless person finding shelter. I still get shivers to this day, thinking about how close that person was to me as I escaped the cellar.